How you doing, folks? This is Finn here. I'm just going through a quick tutorial on how you can create this kind of effect. We'll be using a mix of Blender 2.79 and 2.8, as at the time of recording 2.8 was still an alpha stage and still lacking a couple of features needed to create this. So we'll start off in 2.79, just doing some basic scene setup here, deleting default cube and lamp as one normally does. The most important thing is to set up your frame range to something like 240, like I've gone for, which means that at 24 frames per second, each iteration of the loop will be 10 seconds long, which is just about enough time to create this effect without it looking too rushed. So our first step here is to create a number of paths, which we will use as constraints for the metaballs that we add in later. So I start off just by adding in a circle, and then I duplicate it and scale it a few times. Feel like less is normally more when you're doing this kind of thing, so I'm gonna just add in 4 paths for 4 revolving metaballs that I will have for this animation. So once the paths have been created, we can go ahead and start adding in some metaballs. So once the metaball is added in, I'm going to scale it down and then jump straight over into the properties panel and just change the resolution to 0.1, which will work well for this scene size, but it's important to experiment with this because it will affect the quality of the mesh that we export at the end of this step. So then the metaball is given a follow path constraint to the outer circle on this case, and I change it to be a fixed position, and I keyframe it at the start frame so that the offset is 0, and at the end frame so that the offset is 1. And what this does is it gives us a full revolution on the around the path within the 240 frames. So this process is then repeated for each metaball as I add them in. So I'll probably just speed this piece up a little bit. Also important to add a little bit of variation to the size of the metaballs, just to make this a little bit more visually appealing. At the very end, I add in one last metaball, which will remain in the center without a constraint on it. And this will be the focal point that we will use when we're setting up our scene. At this point, I also drop the frame range by 1 frame, so that will give us a smooth loop. Otherwise, there would be a stutter between frame 240 and the start of the next iteration. Then proceed to set up the scene. I'm going to do this before I edit the path because it'll give me a better idea of how this is going to look in the final scene. I also go into the camera settings at this stage, and I'm going to change the focal length from the default 35 to 60, which gives us a more interesting perspective on what. So at this stage, we're basically going in and editing the paths until we create something that looks more interesting. You can also, while in edit mode, switch the direction of the path, which creates a nice variation. And you can also rotate the paths around on the Z axis, which will give them a nice offset against their neighbors. So once you're happy with what you have, you can select the metaballs. You can see once they go all green like that, they're selected. And then we proceed to export these into an Alembic file, which will be a mesh cache. So just going through the settings here, it's normally all set up perfectly good. Just want to make sure that you use selected objects only. I just turned off some settings that I know I'm not using, like export hair and export particles. At this point, I'm trying to remember how to spell cache, which is always a fun word to spell. And I export. But this is all we needed 2.79 for. So at this stage, once the file is exported, we can jump on over to 2.8. So again, it's just some basic scene setup here in 2.8, deleting the default cube and also the default lamp. So once we have the basic scene set up, we can import our Alembic file. So it's just a matter of going to where you saved it before, and then you'll get your cache file. You can see it's quite a large file, 341 megs, which is quite large, but if it's smaller than that, something hasn't worked for you, I'd say. So now you can see we have our mesh cache data brought in. So when you import the Alembic file, it sets up this mesh sequence cache modifier for you automatically. But it's a good idea to be able to see how this is set up in case you're doing something similar yourself and you have to do it manually. If you had exported more than you intended to, then you can select the mesh cache from this drop-down menu. So the first thing you may notice about your imported mesh is it can be a little bit crinkly around the edges here. A little bit of mesh distortion going on. So I'm just going to set up a view where I can see what's happening. And I'm going to start by adding in a smooth modifier. So I'm just going to crank that all the way up as far as 1. If you push that further than 1, you can get some odd results. So it's better to leave it at 1 and maybe just repeat it a few times. That's looking quite well. Now you could be tempted to add in a subdivision surface, try and smooth this out further, but I find that that actually generates more artifacts than it fixes at the moment. So we'll leave it out. It also slows down the performance. So next we're going to add in the displacement modifier. Just going to reduce the strength down a bit. And we're going to add a texture to this displacement modifier. So you can experiment with all the different options that are here. Verona can be quite good, so can Marble. I'm going to go with Magic in this case. So you can see instantly we have something more interesting happening, although it's a little bit wild over there at the moment. So first thing I do is I kind of play around with this color ramp modifier, try and make it more subtle. End up reversing the ramp because I feel like it gave me a better result. Just increasing the depth here. So it gives us a nice kind of smooth ripple and just bring the turbulence down a bit so we get something that looks nice and smooth for our transition. Now it still looks a little bit wild and crazy, but to fix this we're going to create a target for the texture coordinates for the displace modifier. Coordinates for the displace modifier. So I'll start by adding in a circle, and then I'm going to add an empty in. And same as we did for the metaballs, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the empty a follow path constraint, although I'm doing it manually this time as the shortcut is a little different probably in EEVEE and I haven't figured it out yet. So same as we did with the metaballs, we choose the frame 240 and we key the offset at 1, and for the start frame we key the offset at 0. And that will give us a nice smooth animation on the empty. So now we can use this empty, as it's looping perfectly, we can use it as the coordinates for the displace modifier. Just a little lost with the icons here. There she is. So we just choose object for the texture coordinates. And I'm just going to rename the empty just so it's more obvious what's going on here. Change that to TC for texture coordinates. And then I can select it here. So now we control the scale of the displacement modifier by scaling the empty. You can also add a little bit more interest to this by adjusting the curve. So just a little further tweaking and increase the strength of the displacement, and also scale up the size of the texture using the empty. So at this stage I have something that I'm quite happy with. So I'm just going to proceed to set up the view to match, well, or at least be similar to what we had in the 2.7 file. So again, I just changed the focal length to 60, and I just experiment here until I find a view that is a bit more appealing. So with the view set up, we can head on over to start shading this material. So one of the nice features of 2.8 is these workspaces. So you just click on shading, it's fully set up and ready to go and start shading. So on our render tab here, I'm just going to turn on screen space reflections and refraction. Now I have a material set up already. It's quite complicated, so I wanted to keep the length of this video down a bit. So I'm going to just append the material that I used for the last animation. I've called it broken glass. And I'm just going to give the metaballs this material. So it's a little bit uninspiring at the moment. So this is a basic dispersion shader. It's not even photorealistic. What it basically does is you can give you put in an IOR value and you can offset it and tweak it, and you can tweak the inner roughness and you can tweak the surface roughness. You can also tweak the dispersion So I'm going to speed this part up, but if you want to copy this shader, I do show it all in its entirety here, and you can just slow down the video to see what's happening. But basically, it just splits out the color into RGB, and then we increase and decrease the index of refraction on either side of the color ranges, and it just gives us something a little bit more interesting to play with in terms of a glass shader. So if we just tweak up the inner reference, we already get something interesting. And if I put in the IOR offset to 0.2, I can already see I have some dispersion going on. So as this effect is very HDRI dependent, I'm going to set up my world shader now. So just going to start a new world shader here, and I'm going to open up a HDRI. I've found that you kind of want a HDRI that has a few highlights in it, something like this maybe, or like this, where you have a few different areas that have some highlights in it, as opposed to using something like a sunrise or sunset. You don't want anything too dark, or you won't really get any effect that you're looking for. So once I brought that in, I switched the shading to show the scene world, which at first is quite uninspiring here. So what I proceed to do is search the HDRI for a sweet spot. So I'm just changing the mapping coordinates here and scaling it and moving it around until I find something that gives me the kind of refraction that I'm looking for. So once I found a sweet spot, you can see that the background is actually quite hideous. So I also prefer to have full control over the color of my background. So I'll just add in a second background shader, or background material, and I bring in the light path node. I use isCameraRay as the input for this mix shader, and that will separate out the refracted light from the background. So now I have full control over the color of the background. So with the world set up basically the way I want it, I can go back and start tweaking the glass shader that I've been using. I just switch this back over to object. So by tweaking the settings that are available on this group node, I can already get some interesting effects. Just going to turn off the overlay for the extras and just move the cursor out of the way so I can see what's going on here better. To make things more interesting, I'm going to start adding some textures. So first I'm going to add in a texture, noise texture, which I'm going to use to control a bit of color variance. I'm also going to add in a hue saturation node here, so I can give myself a little bit more saturation. It looks quite nice. And you can also cycle through different variants of the colors by using the hue factor on that. Also, to make this a little bit more interesting, what you can do is you can add in a noise texture and use it, feed it into the inner roughness, which creates an even more interesting effect. So again, I just reduce the scale down, just tweak this a bit until I get something visually interesting. You can control the overall strength here by adjusting the white and black values on that color arm until you get something that you're happy with. So you can see you can go really crazy here by pushing these values around until you get something completely unrealistic but interesting. Once you're happy with the overall look here, you can go back to the world shader and start tweaking it some more. So the first thing I'm going to do back in the world shader is I'm going to just tweak the color a little bit, just to go with the end result from the glass shader. And since we're working with EEVEE, I might as well add some volumetrics to the scene, seeing as EEVEE handles them so well. So I just bring in the principal volume shader and just enable volumetrics over here in the render panel. Just decrease the depth here, it'll give us better quality, and increase the tile size just to improve performance. Then I just bring the density down. Now in the original render, I didn't add in too much extra lights, but I'm gonna add in a point light here in the back because it'll really enhance the volumetric effect that we've created. So I just add in a point light. You can see there we get this nice effect over on the panel, all running real time, of course. I just position it into somewhere where it's not too much of a glare going on, and in the properties panel for the light, just tweak the settings a little bit, bring down the energy, maybe push the color a little bit into the blues here, just so it's a subtle effect. Also, can be nice to play with the depth of field a bit. So I'm just going to add in another empty. Which I'm going to use as a target for the depth of field. This could be then animated as I did in the intro video. So depth of field needs to be enabled in the render panel and also for the camera. So I just use the empty as the target, and I'm going to bring the f-stop down to something like 0.1 and play with this yourselves to see what kind of results you get. And I'm just going to bump up the number of blades, which gives us a nicer effect. At this stage, you could tweak this for hours, I guess. But at this stage, I'm happy enough with the results from this. As I said, you can add further depth to this by animating the point light in the background or animating the target for the depth of field. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, or at least found it interesting. My first ever tutorial. So thanks for watching, and I guess that's all for now. Okay, take care, folks.